Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation TV with your host, Jeff Charles. The debate over education hasn't slowed down a bit, and stories keep surfacing showing how progressives are injecting their ideas on race, sexual orientation, and gender identity in K through 12 classrooms. I have with me Deb Philman, a writer, speaker, content producer, private consultant, and public speaker to discuss the matter. Welcome to the program, Deb.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we get into this topic, it's a really hot button issue. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and what got you interested in this subject?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I'm a mom. So I'm like so many other parents out there. I am and have been for as long as I've had kids, concerned about their education. But I'm also a teacher, and not currently involved in the system, but I was educated to be a public school teacher back in the late 1989, 1990. I got my graduate degree. And because I was not coming out of a sort of left-leaning point of view or philosophy, even then, even as a 23-year-old or so forth, I was already noticing things moving in a very progressive direction back then. I was handed Paulo Freire in one of my classes, and I was told teaching is a political act. And so my little red flags went up even then. And I thought I could work around it. I thought I could go into the system and teach my way and just not adopt their methods. It didn't work out that way. So I left teaching because I couldn't do something that contradicted my values and went into the private sector. But because I do love children and I'm very concerned with helping children learn and get the best education they can, I actually consider it sort of their birthright to have access, especially in a free country, to the best possible means to educate themselves they can get. And so I was always tutoring and offering private, instruction to people on the side, as sort of a side gig. And I did that ongoing, no matter what other jobs I had, even up until I had my own children. Before I had my own kids, I already knew, based on what I was seeing through my tutoring, that I wanted to homeschool them, because I realized that the public school offering was not anything different than what I'd seen during my brief tenure there, and it had actually gotten worse. So I began homeschooling my children. I had 3 girls, and I homeschooled them through some of the early grades, but then unfortunately their dad and I divorced, and they had to go into the public school. That was not my choice, but as people may understand, that if both parents don't agree on the direction, it tends to go with the status quo, and the status quo is public school. So I then became very active. I volunteered. I did everything I possibly could to be physically in the building and monitoring what was going on. And I just got more and more upset. I moved my kids from the regular public school to a charter school, hoping for better. It actually got worse. There was even less transparency. And by the time COVID hit, I had successfully removed 2 of my kids, partly because they'd reached an age where they could tell their father, I'm out, like they wanted to leave. And the last one came out because of COVID, doing virtual school anyway. It seemed logical that I would just take it over. So that brings us to today, where I realized that I almost feel like I'm called. It was a strange way to put it, but I feel like everything has led up to the point where now I can't just talk to people right around me. I feel compelled to help other parents learn what I know. I learned it organically, but over decades. Many of them are sort of just now realizing after COVID and seeing what was going on Zoom, this isn't what I thought it was. What are they doing? Why are they teaching that? And so I feel like I can help get them up to speed more quickly, because I already know what this is, why this is, and what the sort of end goals are. And I feel compelled to do that because I genuinely believe that these children are not just being miseducated and denied the opportunity to true educational freedom, but I think they're being harmed. And so, that's the mom in me, that's the human in me, that's, everything. I don't think that we in a free society should stand by and allow certainly our tax dollars, but in general, to allow people to use our goodwill and our children to further a political agenda. And that's what I see happening.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that I always tell people, because I mean, this became a hot button issue over the past couple of years, like you alluded to, when students were taking classes on Zoom and parents were seeing what was going on. But I've been telling people it didn't just start. It didn't just start a couple of years ago. And whenever I talk to a teacher, I always ask, I'm going to ask you this question: when did you first start noticing this stuff creeping into the classrooms?
Well, I noticed it immediately. I mean, I noticed it in 1991 in my first teaching job. I was in a suburb of Chicago in a public school, and it was a very, very nice town. I mean, it's a town where they filmed Home Alone, Winnetka, Illinois. So, some of the most desirable real estate in the country, and, the schools are supposedly very good. And yet I noticed a push towards a kind of teaching that was very much student-led, away from knowledge-based, much more toward, away from ability tracking, and, almost demonizing the old traditional styles of educating. And I was an elementary school teacher, of educating kids so that everything was in a group, everything was focused on the child's feelings, we were discouraged from any kind of instruct and drill. And I don't mean like I'm going to be boring. I'm even talking about standing at the board and then inviting students up to the board. There's a lot of grayer area in between lecturing at kids in rows and leaving them at desks and groups to work on their own, right? There's a huge range. And I noticed it moving more towards the students were kind of driving the learning, which you'll hear a lot today. And I recognized that as progressive because of the reading I'd done in graduate school with the Freirean stuff, where the idea was that the purpose of education is to free children from oppression, like as early as possible, and so that the system itself, the structure of the classroom, was deemed oppressive if it was remotely traditional. And so I saw that in practice, and I kind of tested it, because every time I would try to do things like multiplication table drills, or I would try to, give an assignment and then walk around the room while the students worked individually, I would get in trouble. My principal or somebody would sort of report me, and it would be, you're not nurturing enough. What? You're not nurturing the students. You're not nurturing their creativity. When I questioned the lack of use of phonics, for example, for teaching of reading in first grade, it was, well, we use whole language, which is, like the Lucy Calkins whole word, guess the word, look in the context. And I said, but that really doesn't work, except for kids who either already are reading. Plenty of kids, this super bright kids whose parents read to them all the time, they come to first grade reading, some of them. And then you have that group of kids that they're going to need a lot of extra help. And phonics is the extra help. They need a code, right? To sort of crack the code of the words they've never seen before. And no matter how much I tried to sneak the phonics in or do phonics, I was told that I was, not doing it right. And maybe I needed to be retrained and so forth. And I just didn't understand, why are you asking me to do things that don't work, demonstrably don't work? Like, I can use my 5 senses to see that this doesn't work, but it's the trend. It's what you want me to do. And so I saw it right away in 1991, and you won't necessarily connect that with politics immediately. And I certainly didn't. I didn't connect it to politics until later. I would say the first I connected these strange practices, although my gut told me this was political, right? You have a gut feeling that this feels very anti-individual. Why are we doing everything as a group? So, but I didn't have hard evidence. It was more just that feeling you have as an individualist. So like, their individual abilities and
something's not right.
It's not right. It's just like, I'm supposed to teach my individual students, even though we're all in a room together, they are still little individuals. So then by the time my own kids, when I moved to North Carolina, I had been living in Boston when I was first married. I had my one daughter, was only 2, but I was looking at the schools. I was really curious. Is there a difference in North Carolina from Massachusetts? I knew Massachusetts was off the rails.
Of course. And you would expect that from Massachusetts.
You would expect that. I came to North Carolina saying, okay, so my Second Amendment rights are more respected. Let's check out what's going on in the schools.
It's got to be different, right?
Let's hope. So I went on a tour of my local, I still pretty much knew I went to homeschool, but I was thought, be fair, be objective. Let's see. So I went to look, and they were so excited taking us on this tour to take us to the lunchroom. And the parent guide or whatever saying, oh, isn't it wonderful? It's only the first week of school and they've already learned how to sit at the tables. And I said, but they're like 7, 8 years old. Like why wouldn't they know how to sit? And she said, do you see how they're skipping a seat between each of them when they brought their lunch to school? Those who brought their own lunch from home, which was a smaller subset. I noticed so many kids going into the line because that particular school that I was zoned for was a Title I school. I mean, it had about 70% free lunch, free and reduced lunch, and 30% not. So the kids bringing a little sack lunch or lunchbox were in the minority. And they would come in, file in, and almost like it was creepy, like little zombies. They would sit on a seat, there'd be an empty seat, sit on a seat, empty seat. And she said, isn't it wonderful? And I said, why? Why are they doing that? Why don't they just sit what they want? And she said, well, we teach them right away that they need to leave space for the free and reduced lunch kids so they don't feel stigmatized, that they don't get a lunch from home from mom and dad. And that was it. Like alarm bells were like, bing, 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 bing. You're obligating a 6-year-old to the projected feelings of another 6-year-old who may or may not even feel that way. And even if they did, that is not the obligation of the other 6-year-old. And it just felt like, what kind of psychological and emotional burden is being put on this little child that they're responsible for the feelings of another person in advance? And it gave me so many bad feelings that when I was then kind of forced to put my kids in the same school, I'll not lie to you, I cried and cried and cried. I was so upset. I felt like somebody was forcing me to abuse my children. It really felt that bad. Now, a lot of people think that's hyperbolic, but I'm like, no, because I had happy, joyful children who were excited to learn, who jumped out of bed every day, grabbing their books. And I knew where that came from. I knew that came from nobody getting in their way and saying they were obligated to anybody else to do anything.
Like they had like giving them that responsibility at such a young age. I mean, I could imagine.
They were doing their own laundry. They knew how, my eldest was 7. She knew how to get up on a little stool and cook her own eggs for breakfast. I mean, they were not miniature adult. They were their own age, but just had so much unbridled joy about learning and reading and doing math that even my 5-year-old and my 7-year-old were doing math at the same level, because the 5-year-old saw the work the 7-year-old was doing and said, can I do that? And I was like, sure, by all means, I'm not gonna stop you. So she could, so she did. There was nobody saying, nope, you're only in, kindergarten, you can't do that. And when she did end up having to walk into first grade that first day, she came home, she said, why are they making me do baby math?
Wow.
Why do I have to go all the way back? I know this. She knew her multiplication tables. She's like, I don't want to do this, Mom. Why do I have to do this? I'm so bored. And then my eldest at the time was she was in third grade, even though at this point she was doing work, math at a 6th grade level. She was reading at a 9th grade level, but obviously age appropriate books. And she was made to tutor the other kids in reading because most of her 3rd grade classmates couldn't read. And they said, well, here, you read to them. You read to them, you tutor them. And she would come home and say, why is going to school, why is my job to read to other kids? I'm a kid.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's like they shouldn't be saddled with that responsibility, or even the idea that they're responsible for how other kids feel if they don't bring their lunch and things like that. And the system is just so rigid. I mean, when I actually went to a Montessori school until I was, at 2nd grade age, and I was way advanced as far as my reading goes. So I know what you're talking about, but I think I may have missed a lot I may have just missed it just by a little bit, because when I was in elementary school, they weren't doing this. And I was born and raised in California. So I know they glommed onto this probably early. So I must have just missed it. But because if it started as early as 91, that was right after I was in elementary school. So
well, it depends too what the graduate schools feeding your district were. So I was hired into that district from University of Pennsylvania because they were like pulling out of my program. And I guess I should have known better, because I was one of 2 people in my graduate school class who ever questioned the teacher. Everybody else was like, this is so, oh yes, I'm a liberator. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, so.
Yeah. So here's my question. What is the objective with injecting these ideas like that are based on critical race theory or gender ideology or sexual orientation? What do you think their objective is when it comes to injecting this stuff into the curriculum with such young children?
I think it's depending on who you're asking about, there are the age-old reasons. One is money. There's a lot of money to be made by making sure as early as possible that humans are consumers, and that they're consumers you can reliably predict or control. So like you can predict their behaviors or you can control their behaviors, then you can just clean up. You can just sort of like make whatever you want and sell it to them pretty much. You're going to reduce the cost of what makes all that so risky, which is it going to be adopted? Are people going to like it? Are they going to buy it? Etc. So you can reduce that cost dramatically if you know in advance, or if you have a consumer that's doing what you want them to do. And that's on the money side. On the power side, and money, power, are they really that different, right? On the power side, if we're looking at government, it's what it always was. The public school system was originally created way back when, explicitly for the purpose of managing and controlling the aspirations of the masses. Because when they brought the Prussian system over, they thought, what a wonderful system. We can control all these people and have them be just like they could just aspire enough. And then we, the elite, we, the people who are kind of controlling things, we obviously think we should if you're already in power, you want to stay there, and you want the people that you like who support you being in power to also stay there. So it's self-serving. And between immigration and freed slaves and everything, the system was put in place to say, we got to assimilate everybody to the place we want them to be. Prussian factory model, they only rise so high. Very anti-American, I would argue unconstitutional, but obviously that battle was lost a long time ago. And so it's working exactly as designed. The problem is that the people who it was pretty much working. We were churning out pretty good, consumer class, going into debt, buying their junk, going on Instagram. But now we have a level of information where, so many lifetimes worth of information are firing at us 24/7 from all different platforms. And ironically, it's harder for the people trying to control us because we have all kinds of independent means of communicating with each other.
Right.
So how are they going to keep us under control when they increasingly have, they have less control over the means of communicating and all that? Well, now we got to change the schools to come up with a new way to sort of dronify the people.
That's a good word for it, dronify. Yeah.
Yeah, that did like the Prussian factory model isn't cutting it anymore, but rather than change the model to be one that is more expansive, that says, hey, we have this unbridled opportunity for creativity and growth and individual accomplishment, and Elon Musk's all over the place. Instead of looking at it like that, they're like, danger, one person can have more power than all of us C students. Okay, because we jokingly, in my line of the work, we call them the C students, like the revenge of the C students, the popular kids that were used to bullying people, but they really were C students. They didn't have a lot of individual aspiration, but they liked being in power in school and they didn't want to give it up. So then they went into power. Okay. So we sort of joke about how they're threatened by individual accomplishment. They're threatened by liberty. Liberty scares the life out of them because they know that ultimately they don't have a lot to offer organically. So you dronify the masses, you prevent upward mobility, you prevent the middle class from ever being anything more than barely the middle class. You're just constantly trying water, like, please, mother, may I, And so when they, every tyrant since time immemorial has said, and some have explicitly said it, I believe Hitler, it's like, give me the child at, 0 and I'll hand them back to you at 7 and they'll belong to the state. I mean, this is, Hannah Arendt talked about it. So many people talk about that. The totalitarian education's purpose is not to get the kid to think a certain set of thoughts. It's to prevent them from having the capability to think any of their own thoughts. So they're externalizing their morality, their philosophy, everything about them is externalized to the loudest voice or the mob. And it's like, where do I go? What do I do, mob? What's the thing today? You see it already. What's the thing? What's the flag I'm supposed to hang outside today?
Yep.
Drive around a neighborhood. There was a black flag. Then it's a trans flag. And now it's Ukraine. It's almost I don't want to laugh because it's not funny, but this education system is designed to do that to all of us. It's just, they're getting farther and farther. And now it's like a snowball rolling downhill where even the people who created it are like,
Yeah, I mean, and it's happening without people even realizing it. People don't see what's going on. So here's one thing I always get when I talk about this stuff. They always say, "Oh, well, this isn't being taught in schools. The critical race theory isn't being taught in schools. There's no gender ideology." And I'm like, there's tons of news stories about it, but I know that they haven't done any studies to see how it's being taught or how many classes they're in, and I don't even know how you would quantify that. But there are plenty of anecdotal examples. So how do you respond when people come at you with that argument?
Well, I guess the way I respond is I say, okay, well, let me ask you this. Do you agree that schools have shifted their focus to equity? Have you seen that coming through on your school's homepage that, we're driven and committed to equity or diversity, equity, inclusion? 99% of people go, well, yeah, of course. So I get them refocused to the DEI conversation because that's inescapable. It's there. We see it. It's on the homepage now, practically of every website. Just go type equity. There it is. Every school by law, federal law from Obama on has had to have an equity plan. So once I get them to admit that there's an equity plan in place, there's diversity, equity, inclusion departments or something important, then I say, okay, well, what do you think equity means? Or what have you been told that equity means? So I get them into a conversation about what has been defined for you as equity, what has been defined for you as diversity and inclusion. Mm-hmm. And then let me ask you, why are those things necessary? How do you know? And then of course, these are Thomas Sowell questions. And then compared to what? So my goal is to get them to think. My goal isn't to contradict them and say, yes, it is. Let me show you the 17 examples of where it is. I mean, I used to do that. And then I realized this is pointless. Their brains turned off. And that's not my goal anyway. My goal is to get them to think about the things they're taking for granted. We get to these places in history because, frog in the pot analogy, we're just slowly introduced to concepts that seem normal. Diversity, it's a good thing, right? Equity, that just means equality, right? Inclusion, why wouldn't we be inclusive? But so when I ask people like, okay, so a couple years ago, was your school very exclusive? Your public school? Was it intentionally blocking the door to these kinds of kids? Was it being vocal about you're not welcome here? What was it? No. Okay. So how do you know the school wasn't already inclusive? And like what, and do they really mean inclusive? Or do they mean we want to give priority status? Let's look at how it's manifesting. What are the things they're saying? Usually by the time, I don't even have to go this far with most people. By the time I get them to the part of, can you have diversity and equity? Can they coexist? In other words, can people really be different in a space and come out equal?
Right, of course.
Most people will eventually go, well, that's not what it means though, is it? I'm like, it isn't precisely what it means. They're going to give different levels of attention and support. They even say so, what they need and when they need it. Okay, well, if it's what each and every kid needs when they need it, there's going to be somebody who misses out. We don't have endless resources. Mm-hmm. So it's either a standardized public system or it's private you at home. Okay, because and the minute you start standardizing, you can't give everyone exactly what they need. And now you're going to have to play favorites. So who's getting and now it's historically marginalized. This is called discrimination, folks. So I just get them to realize that the terms like equity, terms like diversity, terms like inclusion don't mean what they think they mean. They cannot coexist. It's a paradox. And the second they claim they can, you're talking about legalized discrimination, which is critical theory. That is what it is. So even if they're not teaching it in school, I'm like, no, they don't need to. They're teaching within it. They're teaching, well, if these glasses were critical theory glasses and I put them on, I'm now teaching through that. They talk about lenses all the time. I'm using a critical theory lens to look at the world and systems of power and oppression. That's how I see the world. This false dichotomy. I don't need a lesson plan. I just need to live in that space. It's like if we were teaching from an individualist or an objectivist point of view. We would teach everything very, very differently, even the same material. We would look at the Declaration of Independence and we teach it through that lens. Look at it through a critical theory lens and go, they didn't mention women. They didn't mention Black people. They're not free. They're not mentioned here. Look, power, privilege. I mean, you could take any document, you could teach it that way. So you don't need a lesson plan.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So here's my question. What do we do about it? How do parents push back against this stuff?
Well, I get this a lot and people don't like my answer, but as with any other idea that doesn't make sense and it doesn't work, for you or your family, you reject it. But the way that you reject it is you don't interact with it, you disengage with it. So let's say, for example, you were a lifelong churchgoer. Okay. Everybody in your family, everybody in your town, they all went to the church. That was the center of the community, was to go to the church. And you started, on the side, or you just became aware that was not really, you didn't really agree with it, or you didn't believe in it anymore, or something just didn't work for you. It didn't work for you. Would you try to change the church? Would you and maybe 10 of your friends go into the church full of thousands of people that have been going for years and they like it that way, or they're just not aware of the other options as you are? Would you be banging down the door of the church and saying, change your church? Or would you stop going to church? Okay. So I liken it more to that. And people won't like that analogy. It's not religion. I'm like, but isn't it though? Any kind of ideology, any kind of philosophy that you decide you're going to build your life around. You're going to build, when you wake up, when you go to sleep, when you go on vacation, what your weekend looks like, how you raise your children, what they do all day, the adults that are allowed to care for them other than you. Anything that you put that much of your life, energy, and trust and faith in, it doesn't have to have mystical dogma. That's your belief system. Okay. So I think the analogy is fair. It's that if that's where and they're not talking about community schooling, where your whole life will be around the school, including your healthcare. So if you don't want that, you don't fight it. That doesn't even make any sense. You disengage and you go someplace different, or you build someplace different, or you go home, or you find your own way to be spiritual, or whatever the heck it is you do. You don't bang down the door of the church and say, change your church. Now, I grant you, if tens of thousands of other people and you now get critical mass but why would you change the old church? Just build a new one. The energy and resources you're going to expend making the Catholic Church change, for example, and say, let the priests marry, let them marry, or something like that. Wouldn't it be better to go found the Episcopalian church? I'm just giving you examples.
Sure.
And to me, that's the best analogy, because I think it's really close to the same thing.
I do too. I actually define progressivism or wokeism as a religion, because it has a lot in common with that. And maybe we can talk about that at another time, but I wish we had more time to talk about this because there's so much here. But before we close out, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Sure. So you can find me on my YouTube channel at The Reason We Learn. I'm also on Substack, thereasonwelearn.substack.com. And on Twitter, I'm Deb_Fillman. And that's Fillman. I do help parents who are looking for these options. If you're trying to figure out, what does that look like? The last thing I'll leave you with is, we may have called it homeschooling, but try to get the word home out of it and try to get the word schooling out of it. The difference between schooling and education is something you take onto yourself from anywhere at any time. Schooling is done to you. So that is a way to think about it. And when we educate our kids from a home-based perspective, it's home-based. It's not literally at the kitchen table.
Awesome. Well, maybe we can go deeper into it at another time. But for now, thank you for joining the program, Deb.
You're welcome. Sure, no problem.
And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news and analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Just go to LibertyNation.com on your browser, or hit Rumble, YouTube, or check out our Liberty Nation News Roku channel. I'm Jeff Charles. Thanks for watching. This program is a production of LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
The tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it.